This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 23. The Oppressed Meet at Brussels. Towards the end of 1926, I happened to be in Berlin, and I learnt there of a forthcoming Congress of Oppressed Nationalities, which was to be held at Brussels. The idea appealed to me, and I wrote home, suggesting that the Indian National Congress might take official part in the Brussels Congress. My suggestion was approved, and I was appointed the Indian Congress representative for this purpose. The Brussels Congress was held early in February 1927. I do not know who originated the idea. Berlin was at the time a center which attracted political exiles and radical elements from abroad. It was gradually catching up Paris in that respect. The communist element was also strong there. Ideas of some common action between oppressed nations inter se, as well as between them and the Labour left wing, were very much in the air. It was felt more and more that the struggle for freedom was a common one against the thing that was imperialism, and joint deliberation, and where possible, joint action were desirable. The colonial powers, England, France, Italy, etc., were naturally hostile to any such attempts being made, but Germany was, since the war, no longer a colonial power, and the German government viewed with a benevolent neutrality the growth of agitation in the colonies and dependencies of other powers. This was one of the reasons which made Berlin a center for advanced and disaffected elements from abroad. Among these, the most prominent and active were the Chinese belonging to the left wing of the Kuomintang, which was then sweeping across China, and the old feudal elements seemed to be rolling down before its irresistible advance. Even the imperialist powers lost their aggressive habits and minatory tone before this new phenomenon. It appeared that the solution of the problem of China's unity and freedom could not long be delayed. The Kuomintang was flushed with success, but it knew the difficulties that lay ahead, and it wanted to strengthen itself by international propaganda. Probably it was the left wing of the party, cooperating with communists and near-communists abroad, that laid stress on this propaganda, both to strengthen China's national position abroad and its own position in the party ranks at home. The party had not split up at the time into two or more rival and bitterly hostile groups, and presented, to all outward seeming, a united front. The European representatives of the Kuomintang, therefore, welcomed the idea of the Congress of Oppressed Nationalities. Perhaps they even originated the idea jointly with some other people. Some communists and near-communists were also at the back of the proposal right from the beginning, but, as a whole, the communist element kept in the background. Active support and help also came from Latin America, which was chafing at the time at the economic imperialism of the United States. Mexico, with a radical president and policy, was eager to take the lead in a Latin American bloc against the United States, and Mexico, therefore, took great interest in the Brussels Congress. Officially, the government could not take part, but it sent one of its leading diplomats to be present as a benevolent observer. There were also present at Brussels representatives from the national organizations of Java, Indochina, Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Arabs from North Africa, and African Negroes. Then there were many left-wing labor organizations represented, and several well-known men who had played a leading part in European labor struggles for a generation were present. Communists were there also, and they took an important part in the proceedings. They came not as communists, but as representatives of trade union or similar organizations. George Lansbury was elected president, and he delivered an eloquent address. That in itself was proof that the Congress was not so rabid after all, nor was it merely hitched on to the star of communism. But there is no doubt that the gathering was friendly towards the communists, and even though agreement might be lacking on some matters, there appeared to be several common grounds for action. Mr. Lansbury agreed to be president also of the permanent organization that was formed, the League Against Imperialism. But he repented of his rash behavior soon, or perhaps his colleagues of the British Labour Party did not approve of it. The Labour Party was His Majesty's opposition then, soon to blossom out as His Majesty's government, and future cabinet ministers cannot dabble in risky and revolutionary politics. Mr. Lansbury resigned from the presidentship on the ground of being too busy for it. He even resigned from the membership of the League. I was hurt by this sudden change in a person whose speech I had admired only 2 or 3 months earlier. The League Against Imperialism had, however, quite a number of distinguished persons as its patrons. Einstein was one of them, and Madame Sun Yat-sen, and, I think, Romain Rolland. Many months later, Einstein resigned, as he disagreed with the pro-Arab policy of the League in the Arab-Jewish quarrels in Palestine. The Brussels Congress, as well as the subsequent committee meetings of the League, which were held in various places from time to time, helped me to understand some of the problems of colonial and dependent countries. They gave me also an insight into the inner conflicts of the Western labor world. I knew something about them already. I had read about them, but there was no reality behind my knowledge, as there had been no personal contacts. I had some such contacts now, and sometimes had to face problems which reflected these inner conflicts. As between the labour worlds of the Second International and the Third International, my sympathies were with the latter. The whole record of the Second International from the war onwards filled me with distaste, and we in India had had sufficient personal experience of the methods of one of its strongest supports, the British Labour Party. So I turned inevitably with good will towards communism, for whatever its faults, it was at least not hypocritical and not imperialistic. It was not a doctrinal adherence, as I did not know much about the fine points of communism, my acquaintance being limited at the time to its broad features. These attracted me, as also the tremendous changes taking place in Russia. But communists often irritated me by their dictatorial ways, their aggressive and rather vulgar methods, their habit of denouncing everybody who did not agree with them. This reaction was no doubt due, as they would say, to my own bourgeois education and upbringing. It was curious how, in our League Against Imperialism committee meetings, I would usually be on the side of the Anglo-American members on petty matters of argument. There was a certain similarity in our outlook in regard to method at least. We would both object to declamatory and long-winded resolutions, which resembled manifestos. We preferred something simpler and shorter, but the continental tradition was against this. There was often difference of opinion between the communist elements and the non-communists. Usually we agreed on a compromise. Later on, some of us returned to our homes and could not attend any further committee meetings. The Brussels Congress was viewed with some consternation by the foreign and colonial offices of the imperialist powers. Angour, the well-known writer of the British Foreign Office, has given a somewhat sensational and occasionally ludicrous account of it in one of his books. The Congress itself was probably full of international spies, many of the delegates even representing various secret services. We had an amusing instance of this. An American friend of mine who was in Paris had a visit from a Frenchman who belonged to the French Secret Service. It was quite a friendly visit to inquire about certain matters. When he had finished his enquiries, he asked the American if he did not recognize him, for they had met previously. The American looked hard, but he had to admit that he could not place him at all. The Secret Service agent then told him that he had met him at the Brussels Congress as a Negro delegate, with his face, hands, etc., all blacked over. One of the meetings of the Committee of the League Against Imperialism took place at Cologne, and I attended it. After the meeting was over, we were asked to go to Dusseldorf nearby to attend a Sacco Vanzetti meeting. As we were returning from that meeting, we were asked to show our passports to the police. Most of the people had their passports with them, but I had left mine at the hotel in Cologne, as we had only come for a few hours to Dusseldorf. I was thereupon marched to a police station. Fortunately for me, I had companions in distress, an Englishman and his wife, who also had left their passport in Cologne. After about an hour's wait, during which probably telephonic inquiries were made, the police chief was graciously pleased to allow us to depart. The League Against Imperialism veered more towards communism in later years, though at no time, so far as I know, did it lose its individual character. I could only remain in distant touch with it by means of correspondence. In 1931, because of my part in the Delhi truce between the Congress and the Government of India, it grew exceedingly angry with me, and excommunicated me with bell, book, and candle, or to be more accurate, it expelled me by some kind of a resolution. I must confess that it had great provocation, but it might have given me some chance of explaining my position. In the summer of 1927 my father came to Europe. I met him at Venice, and during the next few months we were often together. All of us, my father, my wife, my young sister, and I, paid a brief visit to Moscow in November during the 10th anniversary celebrations of the Soviet. It was a very brief visit, just 3 or 4 days in Moscow, decided upon at the last moment. But we were glad we went, for even that glimpse was worthwhile. It did not, and could not, teach us much about the new Russia, but it did give us a background for our reading. To my father, all such Soviet and collectivist ideas were wholly novel. His whole training had been legal and constitutional, and he could not easily get out of that framework. But he was definitely impressed by what he saw in Moscow. We were in Moscow when the announcement about the Simon Commission was first made. We first read about it in a Moscow sheet. A few days afterwards, father was appearing in the Privy Council in London in an Indian appeal with Sir John Simon as a colleague. It was an old zamindari case in the earlier stages of which, many years previously, I had also appeared. I had no further interest in it, but at Sir John Simon's suggestion, I accompanied my father on one occasion to Sir John's chambers for a consultation. The year 1927 was drawing to an end, and our stay in Europe had been unduly prolonged. Probably we would have returned home sooner, but for father visiting Europe. It was our intention to spend some time in southeastern Europe and Turkey and Egypt on our way back, but there was no time for this then, and I was eager to be back in time for the next Congress session, which was going to be held in Madras at Christmas time. We sailed from Marseilles, my wife, sister, daughter, and I, early in December for Colombo. My father remained in Europe for another 3 months. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Return to India and plunge back into politics. I was returning from Europe in good physical and mental condition. My wife was not yet wholly recovered, but she was far better, and that relieved me of anxiety on her score. I felt full of energy and vitality, and the sense of inner conflict and frustration that had oppressed me so often previously was, for the time being, absent. My outlook was wider, and nationalism by itself seemed to me definitely a narrow and insufficient creed. Political freedom, independence, were no doubt essential, but they were steps only in the right direction. Without social freedom and a socialistic structure of society and the state, neither the country nor the individual could develop much. I felt I had a clearer perception of world affairs, more grip on the present-day world, ever changing as it was. I had read largely, not only on current affairs and politics, but on many other subjects that interested me, cultural and scientific. I found the vast political, economic, and cultural changes going on in Europe and America a fascinating study. Soviet Russia, despite certain unpleasant aspects, attracted me greatly and seemed to hold forth a message of hope to the world. Europe, in the middle 20s, was trying to settle down in a way. The Great Depression was yet to come, but I came back with the conviction that this settling down was superficial only, and big eruptions and mighty changes were in store for Europe and the world in the near future. To train and prepare our country for these world events, to keep in readiness for them as far as we could, seemed to be the immediate task. The preparation was largely an ideological one. First of all, there should be no doubt about the objective of political independence. This should be clearly understood as the only possible political goal for us, something radically different from the vague and confusing talk of dominion status. Then there was the social goal. It would be too much, I felt, to expect the Congress to go far in this direction just then. The Congress was a purely political and nationalistic body, unused to thinking on other lines. but a beginning might be made. Outside the Congress, in labor circles and among the young, the idea could be pushed on much further. For this purpose I wanted to keep myself free from Congress office, and I had a vague idea also of spending some months in remote rural areas to study their conditions. But this was not to be, and events were to drag me again into the heart of Congress politics. Immediately on our arrival in Madras, I was caught in the whirl. I presented a bunch of resolutions to the working committee, resolutions on independence, war danger, association with the League against imperialism, etc., and nearly all of these were accepted and made into official working committee resolutions. I had to put them forward at the open session of the Congress, and to my surprise they were all almost unanimously adopted. The independence resolution was supported even by Mrs. Annie Besant. This all-round support was very gratifying, but I had an uncomfortable feeling that the resolutions were either not understood for what they were, or were distorted to mean something else. That this was so became apparent soon after the Congress, when a controversy arose on the meaning of the independence resolution. These resolutions of mine were somewhat different from the usual Congress resolutions. They represented a new outlook. Many congressmen no doubt liked them. Some had a vague dislike for them, but not enough to make them oppose. Probably the latter thought that they were academic resolutions, making little difference either way, and the best way to get rid of them was to pass them and move on to something more important. The independence resolution thus did not represent then, as it did a year or two later, a vital and irrepressible urge on the part of the Congress. It represented a widespread and growing sentiment. Gandhiji was in Madras, and he attended the open Congress sessions, but he did not take any part in the shaping of policy. He did not attend the meetings of the working committee of which he was a member. That had been his general political attitude in the Congress since the dominance of the Swaraj party. But he was frequently consulted, and little of importance was done without his knowledge. I do not know how far the resolutions I put before the Congress met with his approval. I am inclined to think that he disliked them, not so much because of what they said, but because of their general trend and outlook. He did not, however, criticize them on any occasion. My father was of course away in Europe at the time. The unreality of the independence resolution came out in that very session of the Congress, when another resolution condemning the Simon Commission and appealing for its boycott was considered. As a corollary to this, it was proposed to convene an all-parties conference, which was to draw up a constitution for India. It was manifest that the moderate groups with whom cooperation was sought could never think in terms of independence. The very utmost they could go to was some form of dominion status. I stepped back into the Congress secretaryship. There were personal considerations, the desire of the President for the year, Dr. M.A. Ansari, who was an old and dear friend, and the fact that, as many of my resolutions had been passed, I ought to see them through. It was true that the resolution on the all-parties conference had partly neutralized the effect of my resolutions. Still, much remained. The real reason for my accepting office again was my fear that the Congress might, through the instrumentality of the all-parties conference, or because of other reasons, slide back to a more moderate and compromising position. It seemed to be in a hesitant mood, swinging alternately from one extreme to another. I wanted to prevent, as far as I could, the swing back to moderation and to hold on to the independence objective. The National Congress always attracts a large number of sideshows at its annual sessions. One of the sideshows at Madras was a Republican conference which held its first and last sessions that year. I was asked to preside. The idea appealed to me, as I considered myself a Republican, but I hesitated, as I did not know who was at the back of the new venture, and I did not want to associate myself with mushroom growths. I presided eventually, but later I repented of this, for the Republican conference turned out to be, like so many others, a stillborn affair. For several months I tried, and tried in vain, to get the text of the resolutions passed by it. It is amazing how many of our people love to sponsor new undertakings and then ignore them and leave them to shift for themselves. There is much in the criticism that we are not a persevering lot. Before we had dispersed from Madras after the Congress, news came of the death of Hakim Azmal Khan at Delhi. As an ex-president of the Congress, he was one of its elder statesmen, but he was something more also, and he occupied a unique place in the Congress leadership. Brought up as he was, entirely in the old conservative way, with no touch of modernism in it, and steeped in the culture of imperial Delhi of Mughal days, it was a delight to watch his fine courtesy and hear his unhurried voice and listen to his dry humour. He was, in his manners, a typical aristocrat of the old order, with princely look and princely ways, and even his face bore a marked resemblance to the miniatures of the Mughal sovereigns. Such a person would not ordinarily take to the rough and tumble of politics, and Britishers in India have often sighed for persons of this old type when the new breed of agitators has troubled them. Hakim Sahab had also little to do with politics in his early days. As the head of a famous family of physicians, he was busy with his enormous practice. But even during the latter part of the war events and the influence of his old friend and colleague, Dr. M.A. Ansari, were driving him to the Congress, and subsequent happenings, martial law in the Punjab and the Khilafat question, moved him deeply, and he turned with approval to the new Gandhian technique of non-cooperation. He brought a rare quality and precious gifts to the Congress. He became a link between the old order and the new, and gave the support of the former to the national movement. And thus he produced a harmony between the two, and gave strength and a certain stolidity to the advance guard of the movement. He brought the Hindus and Muslims much nearer to each other, for both honoured him and were influenced by his example. To Gandhiji he became a trusted friend, whose advice in regard to Hindu-Muslim matters was the final word for him. My father and Hakimji had naturally taken to each other. Last year I was accused by some leaders of the Hindu Mahasabha of my ignorance of Hindu sentiments because of my defective education and general background of Persian culture. What culture I possess, or whether I possess any at all, is a little difficult for me to say. Persian, as a language, unhappily, I do not even know. But it is true that my father had grown up in an Indo-Persian cultural atmosphere, which was the legacy in North India of the old Delhi court, and of which, even in these degenerate days, Delhi and Lucknow are the two chief centres. Kashmiri Brahmins had a remarkable capacity for adaptation, and coming down to the Indian plains and finding that this Indo-Persian culture was predominant at the time, they took to it, and produced a number of fine scholars in Persian and Urdu. Later, they adapted themselves with equal rapidity to the changing order, when a knowledge of English and the elements of European culture became necessary. But even now there are many distinguished scholars in Persian among the Kashmiris in India, Sir Tez Bahadur Sapru and Raja Narendra Nath, to mention two of them. Hakim Sahab and my father had thus much in common, and they even discovered old family connections. They became great friends and addressed each other as Bhai Sahab, brother. Politics was the least of their many bonds. In his domestic habits, Hakimji was extraordinarily conservative. He could not, or his family people could not, get out of old habits. I have never seen such amazingly strict parda or seclusion of women as existed in his family. And yet Hakimji was firmly convinced that no nation advanced unless the women of that country freed themselves. He impressed this upon me, and told me how much he admired the part Turkish women had played in their freedom struggle. It was chiefly because of Turkish women, he said, that Kemal Pasha had succeeded. The death of Hakim Azmal Khan was a great blow to the Congress. It meant the removal of one of its stoutest supports. For all of us there has been since then something lacking in a visit to Delhi, for Delhi was so closely associated with Hakimji and his house in Bilimaran. The year 1928 was, politically, a full year, with plenty of activity all over the country. There seemed to be a new impulse moving the people forward, a new stir that was equally present in the most varied groups. Probably the change had been going on gradually during my long absence from the country. It struck me as very considerable on my return. Early in 1926, India was still quiescent, passive, perhaps not fully recovered from the effort of 1919 to 1922. In 1928, she seemed fresh, active, and full of suppressed energy. Everywhere there was evidence of this among the industrial workers, the peasantry, middle-class youth, and the intelligentsia generally. The trade union movement had grown greatly, and the All India Trade Union Congress, established 7 or 8 years previously, was already a strong and representative body. It had not only grown in numbers and in organization, but its ideology was becoming more militant and extreme. Strikes were frequent and class consciousness was growing. The textile industry and the railways were the best organized, and of these the strongest and most advanced unions were the Gurney Kamgar Union of Bombay and the GIP Railway Union. The growth of labor organization had inevitably brought the seeds of internal conflict and disruption from the West, and hardly had the Indian trade union movement established itself when it threatened to split up into rival and hostile camps. There were those who adhered to the Second International, and those who favored the Third, those who were moderately reformist in their outlook, and those who were frankly revolutionary and out for radical changes. In between the two there were various shades and degrees of opinion, and, as is unfortunately the case in all mass organizations, of opportunism. The peasantry was also astir. This was noticeable in the United Provinces, and especially in Awadh, where large gatherings of protesting tenants became common. It was realized that the new Awadh tenancy law, which gave a life tenure and had promised a great deal, made little difference to the hard lot of the peasant. In Gujarat, a conflict on a big scale developed between the peasantry and the government because of the attempt of the latter to increase revenue, Gujarat being an area of peasant proprietors where government deals directly with the peasants. This struggle was the Bardoli Satyagraha under the leadership of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. It was gallantly carried through to the admiration of the rest of India. The Bardoli peasantry met with a considerable measure of success. The real success of their campaign, however, lay in the effect it produced amongst the peasantry all over India. Bardoli became a sign and a symbol of hope and strength and victory to the Indian peasant. Another very noticeable feature of the India of 1928 was the growth of the youth movement. Everywhere youth leagues were being established, youth conferences were being held. They were a very varied lot, from semi-religious groups to others discussing revolutionary ideology and technique. But whatever their origin and auspices, such gatherings of youth always began to discuss the vital social and economic problems of the day, and generally their tendency was for root and branch change. From the purely political point of view, the year was noted for the boycott of the Simon Commission, and, what was called the constructive side of the boycott, the All Parties Conference. The moderate groups cooperated with the Congress in this boycott, and it was remarkably successful. Wherever the Commission went, it was greeted by hostile crowds and the cry of "Simon, go back," and thus vast numbers of the Indian masses became acquainted not only with Sir John Simon's name, but with 2 words of the English language, the only 2 they knew. These words must have become a hated obsession for the members of the Commission. The story is related that once when they were staying at the Western Hostel in New Delhi, the refrain seemed to come to them in the night out of the darkness. They were greatly irritated at being pursued in this way, even at night. As a matter of fact, the noise that disturbed them came from the jackals that infest the waste places of the imperial capital. The All Parties Conference had no difficulty at all in settling the main principles of the Constitution. They were to be of the democratic parliamentary variety, and almost anyone could draw them up. The real difficulty, and the only difficulty, came from the communal or minorities issue, and as the conference had within its fold the representatives of all the extreme communal organizations, an agreement became extraordinarily difficult. It was a repetition of the old infructuous unity conferences. My father, who had returned from Europe in the spring, took great interest in the conference. Ultimately, as a last resource, a small committee was appointed, with my father as chairman, to draft the constitution and make a full report on the communal issue. This committee came to be known as the Nehru Committee, and their subsequent report as the Nehru Report. Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru was also a member of this committee and was responsible for part of the report. I was not a member of this committee, but as Congress Secretary I had much to do with it. It was an awkward situation for me, for I thought it wholly futile to draw up detailed paper constitutions when the real problem was the conquest of power. Another difficulty for me was the inevitable limitations by this mixed committee of our goal to what was called dominion status, and was in fact even less. For me, the real importance of the committee lay in the possibility of its finding a way out of the communal impasse. I did not expect a final solution of this question by some pact or agreement. That solution would only come by a diversion of interest to social and economic issues, but there was the possibility that even a temporary pact, if accepted by a sufficient number of people, would help to ease the situation and thus succeed in diverting interest to other issues. So I did not wish to obstruct the work of the committee, and I gave such help as I could. Success seemed almost within grasp. Only 2 or 3 points remained to settle, and of these the really important one was the Punjab, where there was the Hindu-Muslim-Sikh triangle. The committee in their report considered the question of the Punjab from a novel point of view and supported their recommendation with the help of some revealing figures of the distribution of population. But all this was in vain. Fear and mistrust remained on either side, and the little step to cross the short distance that remained was not taken. The all-parties conference met at Lucknow to consider the report of their committee. Again some of us were in a dilemma, for we did not wish to come in the way of a communal settlement, if that was possible, and yet we were not prepared to yield on the question of independence. We begged that the conference leave this question open, so that each constituent part could have liberty of action on this issue, the Congress adhering to independence, and the more moderate groups to dominion status. But my father had set his heart on the report, and he would not yield, nor perhaps could he under the circumstances. I was thereupon asked by our independence group in the conference, and this was a large one, to make a statement to the conference on its behalf, dissociating ourselves completely from everything that lowered the objective of independence. But we made it further clear that we would not be obstructive, as we did not wish to come in the way of the communal statement. This was not a very effective line to adopt on such a major issue. At best it was a negative gesture. A positive side was given to our attitude by our founding that very day, the Independence for India League. The All-Parties Conference gave me another and a greater shock by adding to the fundamental rights in the proposed constitution, at the instance of the Awadh Talukdars, a clause guaranteeing their vested rights in their talukas. The whole constitution was, of course, based on the idea of private property, but it did seem to me an outrage to make the property rights in the huge semi-feudal estates one of the irremovable foundations of the constitution. This made it clear that the Congress leadership, and much more so the non-Congress people, preferred the company of the landed magnates to that of the socially advanced groups in their own ranks. It was obvious that a wide gulf separated us from many of our leaders, and it seemed a little absurd for me to carry on as General Secretary of the Congress under these circumstances. I offered my resignation on the ground of having been one of the founders of the Independence for India League. But the working committee would not agree to it and told me, as well as Subhash Bose, who had also offered to resign on the same ground, that we could carry on with the League without any conflict with the Congress policy. Indeed, the Congress had already declared for independence, and again I agreed. It was surprising how easy it was to win me over to a withdrawal of my resignation. This happened on many occasions, and as neither party really liked the idea of a break, we clung to every pretext to avoid it. Gandhiji took no part in these all-party conference or committee meetings. He was not even present at the Lucknow conference. Meanwhile, the Simon Commission had been moving about, pursued by black flags and hostile crowds shouting, "Go back!" Occasionally there were minor conflicts between the police and the crowds. Lahore brought matters to a head and suddenly sent a thrill of indignation throughout the country. The anti-Simon Commission demonstration there was headed by Lala Lajpat Rai, and as he stood by the roadside in front of the thousands of demonstrators, he was assaulted and beaten on his chest with a baton by a young English police officer. There had been no attempt whatever on the part of the crowd, much less on the part of Lalaji, to indulge in any methods of violence. Even so, as he stood peacefully by, he and many of his companions were severely beaten by the police. Anyone who takes part in street demonstrations runs the risk of a conflict with the police, and, though our demonstrations were almost always perfectly peaceful, Lalaji must have known of this risk and taken it consciously. But still, the manner of the assault, the needless brutality of it, came as a shock to vast numbers of people in India. Those were the days when we were not used to lathi charges by the police. Our sensitiveness had not been blunted by repeated brutality. To find that even the greatest of our leaders, the foremost and most popular man in the Punjab, could be so treated seemed little short of monstrous, and a dull anger spread all over the country, especially in North India. How helpless we were, how despicable when we could not even protect the honor of our chosen leaders. The physical injury to Lalaji had been serious enough, as he had been hit on the chest and he had long suffered from heart disease. Probably, in the case of a healthy young man, the injury would not have been great, but Lalaji was neither young nor healthy. What effect this physical injury had on his death a few weeks later, it is hardly possible to say definitely, though his doctors were of opinion that it hastened the end. But I think that there can be no doubt that the mental shock which accompanied the physical injury had a tremendous effect on Lalaji. He felt angry and bitter, not so much at the personal humiliation as at the national humiliation involved in the assault on him. It was this sense of national humiliation that weighed on the mind of India, and when Lalaji's death came soon after, inevitably it was connected with the assault, and sorrow itself gave pride of place to anger and indignation. It is well to appreciate this, for only so can we have some understanding of subsequent events, of the phenomenon of
Bhagat Singh,
and of his sudden and amazing popularity in North India. It is very easy and very fatuous to condemn persons or acts without seeking to understand the springs of action, the causes that underlie them.
Bhagat Singh
was not previously well known. He did not become popular because of an act of violence, an act of terrorism. Terrorists have flourished in India off and on for nearly 30 years, and at no time, except in the early days in Bengal, did any of them attain a fraction of that popularity which came to
Bhagat Singh.
This is a patent fact which cannot be denied. It has to be admitted. And another fact, which is equally obvious, is that terrorism, in spite of occasional recrudescence, has no longer any real appeal for the youth of India. 15 years' stress on nonviolence has changed the whole background in India and made the masses much more indifferent to, and even hostile to, the idea of terrorism as a method of political action. Even the classes from which the terrorists are usually drawn, the lower middle classes and intelligentsia, have been powerfully affected by the Congress propaganda against methods of violence. Their active and impatient elements, who think in terms of revolutionary action, also realize fully now that revolution does not come through terrorism, and that terrorism is an outworn and profitless method which comes in the way of real revolutionary action. Terrorism is a dying thing in India and elsewhere, not because of government coercion, which can only suppress and bottle up, not eradicate, but because of basic causes and world events. Terrorism usually represents the infancy of a revolutionary urge in a country. That stage passes, and with it passes terrorism as an important phenomenon. Occasional outbursts may continue because of local causes or individual suppressions. India has undoubtedly passed that stage, and no doubt even the occasional outbursts will gradually die out. But this does not mean that all people in India have ceased to believe in methods of violence. They have, very largely, ceased to believe in individual violence and terrorism, but many, no doubt, still think that a time may come when organized violent methods may be necessary for gaining freedom, as they have often been necessary in other countries. That is today an academic issue which time alone will put to the test. It has nothing to do with terroristic methods.
Bhagat Singh
Thus did not become popular because of his act of terrorism, but because he seemed to vindicate, for the moment, the honor of Lala Lajpat Rai, and through him of the nation. He became a symbol. The act was forgotten, the symbol remained, and within a few months each town and village of the Punjab, and to a lesser extent in the rest of northern India, resounded with his name. Innumerable songs grew up about him, and the popularity that the man achieved was something amazing. A short time after the Simon Commission beating, Lala Lajpat Rai attended a meeting of the All India Congress Committee in Delhi. He bore marks of injuries and was still suffering from the after effects. The meeting was held after the Lucknow All Parties Conference, and the question of independence came up for discussion in some form or other. I forget the exact point that was in issue, but I remember speaking at some length and pointing out that the time had come for the Congress to choose between a revolutionary outlook which involved radical changes in our political and social structure and a reformist objective and method. The speech had no importance, and I would have forgotten it but for the fact that Lalaji replied to it in the committee and criticized some parts of it. One of his warnings was to the effect that we should expect nothing from the British Labour Party. That warning was not necessary so far as I was concerned, for I was not an admirer of the official leadership of British Labour. The only thing that could surprise me in regard to it would have been to find it supporting the struggle for India's freedom, or doing anything effectively anti-imperialist or likely to lead to socialism. On returning to Lahore, Lalaji reverted to the subject of my speech at the AICC meeting and began a series of articles on various issues connected with it in his weekly journal, The People. Only the first article appeared. Before the second could come out in the next week's issue, he was dead.
That first unfinished article of his, perhaps his last writing for publication, has had a melancholy interest for me. End of chapter 24.